Hello and welcome to today's Wired Briefing, Stop Building for Demolition. I'm Greg Williams, the Deputy Global Editorial Director of Wired. So as the world continues to urbanise, the impact of physical infrastructure is being scrutinised like never before. In today's briefing, we'll be exploring the steps needed to change mindsets to measure the true value of property. Part of this is the impact of the industry on the path to net zero. The global construction industry contributes to around 35% of all CO2 emissions. So how do we continue to build the environments of the future while encouraging greener practices such as circularity and modularity? Aside from just bricks and mortar, the construction industry needs to reposition the importance of buildings and the value they deliver for people and communities. To discuss this further, I'm delighted to welcome ISG's Board Director, Richard Hubbard. Richard's career has featured leadership of teams from a variety of sectors, including education, accountancy, and consultancy. He heads up cultural and innovation programs and initiatives and has helped ISG win awards, including the Queen's Award for International Trade. Richard, welcome. Great to have you with us here today.
Pleased to be here. Hi, Greg.
So obviously the title of today's conversation is Stop Building for Demolition. How does the industry need to reposition the importance of buildings and the value they deliver for communities?
Yeah, well, Stop Building for Demolition, the idea behind that is really about looking at the whole life cycle of a building that, as we know, especially here in the UK, can be around for hundreds of years, and then really looking at that through a new lens. So we tend to look at the financial value of a building and perhaps the yields it produces, but only very recently have we seriously started to look at the effect on local communities of a building, that social value element, and also, of course, the environmental impact, which can ebb and flow over time, depending on what the building's actually being used to do.
So it's a whole new kind of framework, really, for thinking about sort of like long-term sort of thinking. Do you think that at the moment that there is the construction industry is embracing this kind of thinking, or is it still all about sort of thinking about margins and putting up buildings in order to sort of fulfill contracts that are in place?
I think we're definitely a work in progress. That would be fair to say. I think we've got a lot of the component parts to make a change. But when I think of how buildings are built, almost the decisions are made before the building is built, and not necessarily, I work in the building trade, but not necessarily there at the concept stage of the conversation. So in a way, it's all well and good saying let's have a modular solution, for instance, but if the building has been designed and reached planning approval, you can't then shoehorn in that kind of stuff retrospectively. So for me, it's a fundamental shift in the traditional roles that we see in construction today, and a different degree of collaboration between local authorities, companies, designers, consultants, and building contractors.
So obviously every large organization is thinking about ESG at the moment. I'd love to get your thoughts on how it's impacting the construction industry. Do you think it's been truly baked into the industry, or are we still kind of in the phase of kind of theorizing rather than doing?
I think the honest truth is it's a mixed picture again. We are seeing clients, for instance, in the public sector, where social value can be 40% of the marks in terms of the bid process. So that is actually driving a different way of thinking and a more ambitious way of thinking beyond the bottom line. So we are seeing a shift. We're also seeing some of the big corporations using some of the ESG accreditation bodies such as EcoVadis or B Corporation, and pushing that responsibility down the supply chain to achieve certain marks in those accreditation schemes. And, you know, that is driving change, and every building company out there will have a strategy that is ESG based. The reality is probably that customer driver will be the one that will really make the change. It's kind of got to start from the top. Right.
So it's a top-down process. So ISG is launching its Sustainable Buildings Monitor report. What conversations are you hoping this kind of piece of research is going to bring to the boardroom and beyond that, really?
Yeah, we'll be launching that fairly soon. I mean, I've just looked at the kind of early findings. What I would say is, what's thought-provoking is that while London, as you would expect, scores very highly from a financial perspective in terms of being attractive to invest in property in London, it doesn't score as well on things like environmental factors or social factors. And so if we can encourage a conversation where ESG is really part of the investment thinking from the start, and I think it should be, because, you know, what is currently a construction asset could easily become a construction liability if we don't get this thinking right at the outset. So my hope for the research is it resets the conversation, gets people thinking beyond those financial aspects, which are still important, but into the kind of social value, the effect on the local community, and the effect on environment, not just at the time of build, but in operation and over time.
And have you seen any examples, like, you know, what does good look like? Have you seen anything in the real world that really kind of exemplifies what you're describing?
Yeah, I have. So actually, Cambridge is a city that kind of comes out fairly well on all of the factors around ESG and investing. And we've recently completed a project for the part of the University of Cambridge, their sustainability leadership operation. And people get sick of me saying this, but 80% of the built assets we will need in 2050, they're here. They're already here. They probably weren't built with sustainability in mind, almost certainly not with social value in mind. So what we need to do is get really clever with what we've got, as well as making new investment decisions cleverly. So the building I would talk about is the HQ for the sustainability leadership operation I just described. It was a 1930s unremarkable building. They turned it into what's called a passive house, which is essentially a building where the fabric is so precisely put together that it requires virtually no heating, no cooling. It's naturally ventilated. Then they applied all of the principles of circularity, so reception desks from streaming, a well-known TV streaming company, recertified lighting taken from another building that we'd taken apart. And the whole thing runs and is net carbon zero. So it's an old building, existing stock, that's been made into a world first passive house retrofit. There are plenty of new built passive houses around, but not retrofits. And that to me is a shining example. And then beyond that, what they're doing is opening the building in the evenings and at the weekends to bring in the local community, because as you can imagine, Cambridge is kind of a city where you're either part of the university community or you're the other part of Cambridge. And, you know, there's less access to opportunity in that part of the community. So they're bringing in businesses and the local community together to do things like training sessions, to show opportunities in different industries that the local community might get to work in. So for me, that's probably the best example of somebody squaring the circle in terms of what we're talking about here.
And that's a great example. And it's obviously sort of something that is, you know, in terms of the long-term approach you're describing, it's a great sort of like exemplar of where we need to get to. What are the kind of barriers to that happening? Like, why can't that be more of a common way of thinking about developing a building?
I think fundamentally the focus is still on the bottom line, and there's a perception of risk in doing something new, and still work in progress around understanding social value and the importance of social value in communities, and the opportunity to make a difference in terms of 2050 and net zero carbon. So work in progress. We are seeing more of it. We are seeing more of it, and legislation will drive that behaviour, because there will be a limiting of the EPC ratings that commercial buildings can have. For instance, in London, new legislation is coming in, so developers face having stranded assets, essentially, that they can't rent out because they don't meet environmental requirements. So unfortunately, the pound sign will probably still be driving behaviour, but it will be driving the right behaviour. It will be making buildings more environmentally responsible. So in some ways, the pound sign is going to drive the right behaviours.
So let's go back to kind of getting to net zero, maybe Richard. So thinking outside of financial reporting, how do you expect progress and success to be measured? Do we need to be thinking more holistically, do you think?
I think we do, and net zero is a big part of the problem, but it's not all the problem. We have ratings for buildings when they complete. So things like BREEAM and LEED and those sort of things, they will measure the environmental performance of the build. Now, the problem there is that then you might set up the most exquisitely complicated building that has all kinds of smart systems to control it. But what we see happening is, you know, the person that's running the building, they may understand it from the offset, they may not. And, you know, they may leave that building, somebody else comes in, they switch it all off because it's too complicated. And what happens, the building starts pumping out carbon. So in terms of measurement, what we need is that commitment to ongoing measurement. And there are things like BREEAM in use. There's a scheme called Neighbours that is starting to be introduced, but that's still fledgling. And then we need to look more holistically, as you said, Greg. So it's things like social value. At the moment, any measurement around social value tends to be a pound sign. How much social value did we add in terms of pounds and pence? Now, what that doesn't measure is, was that the right type of social value for that community? It's not needs-based. It's just we gave 50 people hours over the course of this week to do this activity. Now, that activity may not actually deliver social value to that community. So it's almost accepting a more qual type of measurement in the social value piece that almost tells the story of how a building can add value to a community. And you know, you talk to real people in the street about that and say, you know, what's this done for you? And that's very different in the built environment, that kind of thinking.
Yeah, and it's hard to quantify. So just more broadly, like, do you know, or do we know what good looks like when it comes to ESG metrics?
Do I know what good looks like when it comes to ESG metrics? I think for the built environment, there is still some work to be done to actually set these up correctly. So you've got organisations like the Green Building Council looking at things like the scopes of carbon emissions, you know, and actually what's that mean, and to what degree do you take things like scope 3? Because you could build a school and the janitor could go to that school in a diesel car that's pumping out pollution, and you could count that within your scope 3 potentially. So I know that there are organisations like the Green Building Council who are working on definitions that we all work to, and I think even establishing that baseline would be real progress. You'll find that most of the builders, the contractors out there, will be certainly setting an ambition for carbon neutral or carbon positive by 2030 at the latest. And there's a race to shave time off that, as you can imagine, you know, and that's sort of partly doing the right thing and partly competitive spirit. So we are seeing increased commonality as more and more of the industry take on ESG reporting as their business strategy, not just something they do on the side, but there is actually something for the industry to do to actually define what we are measuring against in terms of science-based targets, in terms of carbon emission scopes.
And presumably, I mean, you mentioned policy earlier on, but local authorities are going to play quite a big role in reframing the value of ESG or ESG values, I should say.
100%, because if I'm a developer and I want to get through planning smoothly, I will pretty much do what the local authority needs me to do. Now, if the local authority can be part of the reframing of what good looks like in terms of sustainable value, in terms of embedding ESG into value, then what we will find is that the developers and the clients will be compliant, and that will again drive good behaviors. So the local authorities, for me, really hold the key to helping us to drive good behavior. And I'm optimistic because we are seeing really, I was with a client from the MOJ yesterday, really progressive things happening in central government that will filter down to local government. And I think that is absolutely critical to making the change.
And obviously this is why, so we have to talk about technology, and I'd love to get your thoughts on sort of like some of the kind of emerging technologies that we're seeing and ways of working. So I mentioned modularity earlier on. I often see sort of like videos of buildings being 3D printed, and we are seeing sort of some of these really interesting sort of like new ways of constructing buildings. Do you think that sort of some of these new kind of technologies, new ways of thinking, are they going to be able to help us with tackling some of the challenges that you've been outlining?
In principle, they should be an absolutely key part. So, in concept, you could build a hospital tomorrow in a modular way. It will have zero waste because everything will be factory built off-site and bought site, hopefully on electric vehicles, and then assembled on site. So rather than lots of raw materials, steel, concrete, all those things appearing as raw materials on site, you will have buildings that are partially assembled, built in factories, zero waste. They come to site. Now, you could decide after that hospital has run for 3 years that actually it's not in the right place and it's no longer fit for purpose. You could break that building up, reuse all the components, and make 3 schools out of it in a different location by, again, putting the parts on the back of a electric vehicle. So there are tremendous opportunities in modularity, but again, I come back to, we need to change the way the industry works, because we need to find the balance between iconic design and all the good things that come with, like the Guggenheim effect in Bilbao and all of that good stuff that we see over there, with practicality around modular, and they all need to be considerations right up front. So again, that early engagement of all the key players to come up with a solution is going to be critical. So modularity is one part of technology. You've mentioned 3D printing, and you can do that in relatively small buildings at the moment. Mainly good for speed, not necessarily fantastic environmental benefits to that. And then obviously things like AI, building information modeling. We do things at the moment where we are building facilities for surgeons, rooms for surgeons, where we will literally rig them up to a virtual reality kit so they can decide how they want their room set up. And they actually say, no, move that, a meter to the right and that 30 centimeters closer to me, and that kind of thing. So that whole experiencing a building in a virtual world before you've put the thing up is something that's happening in the here and now. That's all real. So technology will be critical, but it will remain a gimmick and in the periphery unless we can change mindsets that actually not everything has to be bespoke. Because what we're talking about here is a standardized kit of parts, That's the sort of, you know, the end point to all this. If you took it to its furthest extreme and really put sustainability, ESG at its core, you'd end up with a materials bank effectively that you could endlessly take apart and rebuild as something else. And that's where you get real circularity.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what you've just described, that this real circularity, what impact do you suspect this is going to have on the people in those buildings, either people working in them or people, you know, living in them or just operating in them? Like, how will that affect the human beings in the equation, as it were?
Well, I'm hoping that what we will do is get much better at actually consulting people before we put buildings up, having a longer term view, and then you would hope that it will benefit them. I've seen social value in real buildings in London really work. And I think of what used to be the Crystal Building is now City Hall. The one consistent thread that I've seen through that is there was always a community area in that building, and it has been consistently used throughout. So when you get that upfront thinking, that is when you see an effect on the users. In terms of the workforce in my industry, it's going to have a real difference, because we're going to need a different skill set if we go down this route. You know, you're looking at the moment, what construction people do is travel to sites and live away from home. Now, if buildings are being put together in factories, it's going to become much more like a factory job, where you go to the same workplace every day, you're warm, you're dry, you can, you know, achieve a different kind of work-life balance. You go home to your family at the end of the night. So some of these technologies and changes will fundamentally change the workforce in terms of what we bring into the industry. It's going to open the industry up to groups that aren't well represented in construction. Women's the obvious one, but there's a much broader set. So yeah, so I'm excited about some of the changes that this could bring around for construction and the built environment.
And a final question, I guess, which is all around mindsets. So obviously, you know, construction industry is, you know, pretty sort of, I'd say kind of up there in terms of, you know, technology and thinking about how it can be used, you know, for various solutions. Do you think, though, that there is a kind of a kind of like a mindset shift that needs to occur?
Yeah, without a doubt, because although there is a lot of technology in construction now, is it embedded across the piece? I would argue not. And so the mind shift has to come from collaboration between the traditional players in the industry. It's when the contractor and the designer and the consultant and the client are around a table early on. That is when you see the mind shift. And I've seen work on the prisons framework, new women's prisons that are being built in the UK at the moment, where actually people are put in all the major players are put in a room to come up with a solution together that they collaborate on. And it's a kind of pain and gain. It's like, well, we'll choose 4 contractors who will work with designers to come up with a design. There are 4 prisons, you will get 1 each. But it's a completely different way of working to the traditional model of, you know, race to the bottom, which can still be the case, you know, cheapest first. And we are seeing a change without a doubt. I'm optimistic. We're seeing quality, ESG, all of these as marked considerations in the bid process. But until you get the right people right around the table at the concept stage, the REBA concept stage, before you even put pen to paper, technology and things like that will still be an add-on, a gimmick, the exception. So massive opportunity in my mind.
Well, it's great to end on a note of positivity and optimism. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insight. And we look forward to one day there being no demolition, just modularity and circularity. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Greg.
If you enjoyed today's session, please do check out other Wired virtual briefings at wired.co.uk. Thank you all for joining us today. We will see you soon. Take care.